A horse barn doesn't just spontaneously explode into flames. Unless you're living next to Monica Langford, HOA president, chaos incarnate, and self-declared enemy of anything that breathes without designer approval. One day I had 3 happy horses and peace and quiet. Next thing I know, I'm knee-deep in fines, accusations, and eventually, smoke. Let's just say when power-tripping suburban royalty messes with the wrong neighbor, things can spiral faster than you can say Section 12.3a. Ever had a neighbor who treats the HOA like their personal army? Drop your city in the comments. I want to see how many Monicas are roaming free out there. I never thought living peacefully would be such a challenge. My name is Wade Callahan, and I'm a 41-year-old former logistics sergeant who retired early and bought a small ranch in Meadowbrook Estates, Texas. It was the kind of neighborhood where grass height mattered more than your character. I bought my property because it came with enough land to keep my 3 horses: Thunder, Storm, and Lightning. The only family I really needed after my military service ended. I thought I'd found my slice of paradise, somewhere I could live quietly and enjoy the simple pleasure of caring for my animals. The trouble started on a Tuesday afternoon in late September. I was out brushing Thunder when I heard the click of expensive heels on gravel. I looked up to see a woman in her late 30s approaching my fence, wearing a pristine white blazer that probably cost more than most people's monthly rent. Her blonde hair was pulled back in a perfect bun, and she carried herself with the kind of confidence that comes from never being told no. This was Monica Langford, though I didn't know her name yet. What I did know was that she was looking at my horses like they were diseased rats. "Excuse me," she called out, her voice carrying that particular tone of authority that some people mistake for politeness. "Are you the owner of this facility?" She said facility like it was a 4-letter word, her nose wrinkling slightly as a gentle breeze carried the natural scent of horses in her direction. I walked over to the fence, still holding Thunder's brush. "I am Wade Callahan. And you are?" She didn't extend her hand for a shake, instead pulling a folded document from her leather briefcase. "Monica Langford, president of the Meadowbrook Estates Homeowners Association. I'm here regarding several violations that have been brought to our attention." I raised an eyebrow. "Violations?" Monica unfolded the paper with the dramatic flair of someone revealing a royal decree. "The odor emanating from your property is inconsistent with the high-quality living standards of our community. Additionally, the noise level from your animals is disruptive to your neighbors' peaceful enjoyment of their properties." I had to bite back a laugh. The odor she was referring to was the completely natural smell of clean horses and fresh hay. As for noise, my horses were about as quiet as horses could be, certainly quieter than the leaf blowers that ran every morning at 7 a.m. sharp throughout the neighborhood. "Ma'am, when I purchased this property, there were no restrictions on keeping horses. I checked all the HOA bylaws thoroughly." Monica's smile grew colder. "Rules evolve, Mr. Callahan. Communities must adapt to maintain their standards." She handed me the paper. "You have 30 days to address these issues. I trust you'll make the right decision." I glanced at the document. It was a formal violation notice demanding I remove the offensive odors and excessive noise or face daily fines of $300. The notice was dated today and signed with Monica's elaborate signature. "What exactly constitutes addressing these issues?" I asked. Monica's smile never wavered. "I think that's fairly obvious, don't you? Perhaps you should consider relocating your hobby to a more appropriate venue." The way she said hobby made it clear she viewed my horses as nothing more than an inconvenience to her perfect suburban vision. I felt my jaw tighten, but I kept my voice level. "These aren't hobbies, Ms. Langford. These are living creatures that depend on me for their care." Monica glanced at her expensive watch. "I'm sure you'll figure something out. 30 days, Mr. Callahan." She turned and walked away, her heels clicking back toward the street where a gleaming white BMW waited. I watched her go, noticing how she held a tissue to her nose until she was well away from my property. As she drove off, I looked down at the violation notice again. At the bottom, in small print, was a reference to Community Standard Code Section 12.3a, a section I was absolutely certain hadn't existed when I'd reviewed the HOA documents 18 months ago. That evening, I sat on my porch with a beer, watching my horses graze peacefully in the pasture. Thunder lifted his head and looked toward Monica's mansion, which was visible through the trees about 200 yards away. Even from this distance, I could see the massive infinity pool that dominated her backyard, surrounded by perfectly manicured landscaping that looked like it belonged in a resort brochure. The irony wasn't lost on me. She lived in a house that probably cost more than most people would see in a lifetime, complete with outdoor speakers that regularly blasted classical music during her evening wine sessions. Yet my quiet horses were somehow the problem. I realized this wasn't really about odors or noise. This was about control, about someone who couldn't stand the idea that not every inch of her perfect community looked exactly the way she wanted it to look. The next morning, I decided to do some research. I pulled out my original HOA documents and compared them to Monica's violation notice. Sure enough, Section 12.3a didn't exist in my paperwork. Someone had added new rules without proper notification, and I had a pretty good idea who was behind it. No meeting minutes, no community votes, just a phantom rule that had materialized out of thin air to serve Monica's agenda. Around noon, I walked over to talk to my neighbor Russell Dean, a 68-year-old retired police officer who lived in the house closest to my property. Russell was working in his garden when I approached, and he looked up with the weathered smile of someone who'd seen enough of the world to find humor in most situations. "Afternoon, Wade. You look like a man with something on his mind." I showed him Monica's violation notice. Russell read it carefully, his expression growing more serious with each line. "Well, I'll be damned," he said finally. "She's really going after you, isn't she?" I asked him what he meant, and Russell set down his gardening tools. "You're not the first one, son. Monica pulled the same routine on the Hendersons and old Mr. Peterson," Russell said, his voice dropping. "The Hendersons had a vegetable garden that she claimed attracted undesirable wildlife. Peterson restored antique furniture in his garage. Beautiful, quiet work. But Monica decided sandpaper was industrial noise. Both families ended up selling at a loss just to escape the constant harassment." Russell shook his head. "Monica bought Peterson's property through a shell company and turned it into her meditation garden. Now she's got crews out there with leaf blowers maintaining the damn thing every other day." The pattern was becoming clear. Monica wasn't just controlling, she was systematically removing anyone whose lifestyle didn't match her pristine suburban vision. That afternoon, I decided to fight back with a little humor. I created an official-looking invoice on my computer with letterhead reading Callahan Ranch Therapeutic Services. The bill was addressed to Monica Langford and itemized my services. Equine aromatherapy treatment, natural stress relief through organic horse-scented air purification, $299. I added a note explaining that the treatment was designed to help uptight individuals reconnect with nature and reduce anxiety through exposure to authentic farm experiences. I printed it on high-quality paper and personally delivered it to the HOA office near the community entrance. The HOA office was a sterile space with white walls and a motivational poster that said, "Excellence begins with you." The nervous secretary looked at my envelope like it might explode. "This is for Miss Langford," I said with my most professional smile, "regarding the therapeutic services I've been providing to the community." She nodded uncertainly and placed the envelope in Monica's inbox. I thanked her and left, feeling better than I had since this mess started. Monica's retaliation came swiftly. Around 4 in the afternoon, my power went out. I called the power company and learned that someone had filed a complaint about potential electrical hazards at my address. Service would remain disconnected until a full safety assessment could be completed. The earliest appointment was in 2 weeks. I hung up and looked around my now dark house, realizing Monica wasn't just playing games anymore. He was escalating this conflict in ways that could actually harm my animals. The lack of power would soon affect my horse's water supply and the lighting system that kept them calm during evening hours. That evening, I sat on my porch in the darkness, using a battery-powered radio for company. Across the way, Monica's mansion blazed with light, her pool glowing like a beacon in the night. I could see figures moving around the pool area. Monica was hosting one of her regular social gatherings, complete with catered food and live music. The sound of laughter and clinking glasses drifted across the distance, a stark contrast to my powerless property. As I watched, Monica herself appeared on her deck, wineglass in hand, and I swear she looked directly at my dark house and smiled. That's when I knew this conflict was going to get much worse before it got better. The next week brought a parade of inspectors to my property, noise specialists with decibel meters, air quality experts taking samples, and landscaping inspectors measuring grass height with rulers. By midweek, I'd been fined for my horse's breathing, eating, and existing. Each inspection resulted in a new penalty, $150 for excessive noise from livestock, $200 for non-compliant vegetation height. I was operating my entire property off a gas-powered generator that was actually louder than my horses had ever been. But apparently mechanical noise didn't violate Monica's community standards. By Thursday morning, I'd received over $600 in fines. Monica's game was clear now, death by 1,000 cuts. I'd seen the aftermath before. The Hendersons gone, Peterson's tools silenced, and now it was my turn in her slow-burn purge of undesirables. But Monica had made one crucial miscalculation. I wasn't some suburban homeowner who'd fold under pressure. I was a former military man who dealt with much worse situations than a power-hungry HOA president. That morning, I decided to take the offensive in my own small way. I had 3 horses who needed daily exercise, and the community had plenty of public streets where I could walk them. So every morning at exactly 6:30 a.m., right when Monica liked to have her coffee and check her emails on her deck, I began walking thunder, storm, and lightning along the street that passed directly in front of her mansion. The first time I did it, Monica was in her usual spot, wearing a silk robe and holding a steaming mug of what was probably $50 per pound coffee. When she saw me approaching with my horses, her face went through a series of expressions: confusion, recognition, and finally pure irritation. She immediately stood up and retreated into her house, slamming the sliding door behind her. The second morning, Monica was ready for me. She stood on her deck with a tissue pressed to her nose, glaring at me as I led my horses past her property. "This is harassment, Mr. Callahan," she called out. I smiled and waved. "Just exercising my horses on public property, Ms. Langford. Community wellness is important, don't you think?" She disappeared into her house again, but I could see her watching from behind her curtains as we continued our peaceful walk. By the third morning, she had given up on her morning coffee routine entirely, staying inside until I'd passed by. It was a small victory, but it felt good to disrupt her perfect morning ritual the way she'd been disrupting my life. Russell Dean got a kick out of my new morning routine. "You're really getting under her skin," he told me as I walked the horses past his house on Friday morning. "She called the police yesterday, you know, told them you were menacing her with livestock." I stopped walking. "What did the police say?" Russell chuckled. "Officer Martinez came by to talk to me about it. I told him you were just a man exercising his horses on public streets, which is perfectly legal. Martinez said he'd have to file a report, but there wasn't anything they could do about someone walking their animals in accordance with local ordinances." Russell lowered his voice. "Between you and me, Martinez thinks Monica's complaints are getting a little ridiculous. Apparently she's called the police 14 times in the past 6 months about various community disruptions." That afternoon, I created a second invoice from my Callahan Ranch Therapeutic Services. This one itemized a new service: Natural Wake-Up Call Premium Equine Assisted Morning Wellness Program featuring authentic countryside sounds and aromatherapy. $199. I noted that the service had been provided daily for the past week, and that customer satisfaction appeared to be high based on the enthusiastic response from the recipient. I delivered this invoice to the HOA office with the same professional demeanor as the first one, watching the secretary's increasingly bewildered expression. Monica's retaliation came swiftly. That evening I received a call from the county sheriff's office about aggressive animals on my property. When Deputy Johnson arrived the next morning, he was clearly expecting vicious dogs or dangerous exotic animals. Instead, he found 3 of the most docile horses in Texas, contentedly munching grass and paying no attention to humans unless someone brought them carrots. "These are the aggressive animals?" he asked, watching Thunder allow me to scratch behind his ears. Deputy Johnson spent 15 minutes petting my horses and commenting on how well-behaved they were. "Sir, I've got to file a report. But these animals are about as dangerous as golden retrievers. Some people have too much time on their hands." That night, Monica had played every HOA card in the deck: noise, odor, lawn height, animal control, even a sheriff's visit. None of it stuck. Her rulebook was exhausted, but her ego wasn't. I had a sinking feeling that her next move would be something more drastic, something that couldn't be solved with paperwork and phone calls. I walked out to check on my horses one more time before bed, and I noticed something that made my blood run cold. There were fresh footprints around the barn that didn't belong to me, and the fence had been cut in one place. Not broken, but cleanly cut with wire cutters. Someone had been on my property, and I had a pretty good idea who was behind it. I thought maybe the HOA had finally come to its senses when I received a letter inviting me to a mediation session at the clubhouse. It sounded almost civil. Almost. I showed up early, dressed like someone who still believed in process. Inside there were 3 chairs, 1 folding table, and 2 people waiting. Monica Langford in a cream pantsuit that screamed litigation, and a man in a maroon polo who introduced himself as community legal advisor Greg. I asked, "Legal advisor for whom?" He smiled and said, "For the homeowner's best interest." Monica slid a folder across the table labeled Behavioral Incompatibility Report, which, in plain English, meant, "You don't belong here." The document cited olfactory distress zones, animal-generated auditory pollution, and something called ambient visual clutter. I asked if I could respond. Monica said they'd mailed the opportunity last month. I never got it. Of course I didn't. Greg suggested I consider voluntary relocation of equine assets to preserve communal well-being. I stared at them both, smiled, and tore the report clean down the middle. "You want a war in khakis and clipboards?" I said. "Fine, but don't act surprised when I fight back with hooves and headlines." I spent most of that sleepless night patrolling my property with a flashlight, checking and rechecking the barn, the fence line, and anywhere else an intruder might have been. The cut in the fence was professional, clean, precise, and positioned where it would be difficult to spot during casual inspection. Someone had planned this carefully, and that someone had skills beyond what I'd expect from a typical suburban troublemaker. When dawn finally broke, I called Russell and asked him to come take a look at the damage. Russell examined the cut fence with the methodical attention of his police background, taking photos and measuring the opening. This wasn't some random vandalism, he concluded. Whoever did this knew exactly what they were doing. They cut just enough to create an access point, but not enough to let your horses wander out accidentally. The implications were chilling. Someone had been scouting my property, learning the layout, planning for future access. I immediately drove to the hardware store and bought motion sensor lights, trail cameras, and additional fencing materials. I turned the property into something between Fort Knox and a hunting blind. Motion sensors on every post. Trail cams watching every blind spot. Anyone stepping on my land would light up like a crisp. The work was exhausting, made worse by the summer heat and the constant drone of my rental generator. But I knew my horse's safety depended on these precautions. As I worked, I noticed several cars slowing down as they passed my property. Neighbors curious about the sudden burst of security improvements. Around noon, I had an unexpected visitor. Derek Winslow, the vice president of the HOA, pulled into my driveway in a late-model pickup truck. Derek was a heavy-set man in his mid-40s who owned a small plumbing supply business in town. I'd met him briefly at a community barbecue the previous summer, and he'd seemed like a reasonable guy, certainly more approachable than Monica. "Afternoon, Wade," he called out as he climbed down from his truck. "Mind if we have a word?" I set down my tools and walked over to meet him. Derek looked around at my new security lights and cameras with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Looks like you're expecting trouble," he said. "Just taking some precautions," I replied. "Someone cut my fence last night." Derek's face went pale. "Cut your fence? Jesus, Wade, that's serious stuff. Did you call the police?" I told him about Deputy Johnson's visit and the investigation that was supposedly underway. Derek nodded thoughtfully, then glanced around to make sure we weren't being overheard. "Look, Wade, I came here to give you some friendly advice. Things are getting pretty heated between you and Monica, and I'm worried about where this is all heading." He paused, choosing his words carefully. "You know how some people make friends in high places? Monica built a palace there. City planners owe her favors, sheriff's deputies wave when she drives by, and if she doesn't like your business, your contracts evaporate overnight." I asked him what he was trying to tell me. Derek sighed and stepped closer, his voice dropping to almost a whisper. "I'm saying that Monica has ways of solving problems that go beyond HOA violations and fines. She doesn't like loose ends, and she really doesn't like people who don't play by her rules." The conversation was making me increasingly uncomfortable. Derek wasn't just warning me about Monica's influence, he was warning me about Monica herself. "Are you saying she's dangerous?" I asked directly. Derek looked around again, then stepped even closer. "I'm saying that the Hendersons didn't just leave because of HOA pressure. Their house was broken into 3 times in 2 weeks. Nothing was stolen, but the message was clear. Mr. Peterson's workshop had a mysterious fire that the investigators could never explain, and there have been other incidents with other people who crossed Monica." Derek's voice became barely audible. "She told me once, if I ever vote against her on a board issue, she'd make sure I'd be plumbing toilets in prison bathrooms. I like you, Wade, and I respect what you're trying to do here. but maybe it's time to consider cutting your losses and finding a new place for your horses." After Derek left, I sat on my porch and tried to process what he'd told me. The pattern of harassment suddenly made more sense. Monica wasn't just using bureaucratic pressure to get rid of unwanted neighbors. She was orchestrating a campaign of intimidation that included actual criminal activity. The cut fence, the mysterious electrical problems, the parade of inspectors, it was all part of a larger strategy designed to make my life so miserable that I'd voluntarily leave. But Derek's visit had also revealed something else. Not everyone in the HOA was completely under Monica's control. Derek was scared, but he'd taken a risk to warn me. That suggested there might be other people in the community who were fed up with Monica's tactics. That afternoon, I made a difficult decision. I called my friend Jake Martinez, who owned a horse ranch about 20 miles away, and asked if he could board my horses temporarily. Jake didn't ask questions, he just said to bring them over whenever I was ready. I spent the evening loading thunder, storm, and lightning into a borrowed horse trailer, talking to each of them as I secured their halters. "This is just temporary," I promised them. "We're going to get through this, and then you're coming home." As I drove them to Jake's ranch, I felt like I was surrendering, giving Monica exactly what she wanted. But I also knew that my horse's safety was more important than my pride. And I returned to my empty property that night. The silence was deafening. For the first time in 18 months, there were no gentle snorts from the barn, no soft footsteps in the pasture, no comforting presence of the animals I'd grown to love. I sat in my dark house, still without power, and realized that Monica had won this round. She'd forced me to remove my horses, effectively achieving her goal of eliminating the problem she'd complained about. But as I sat there in the darkness, I also realized something else. I was no longer worried about protecting my horses from whatever Monica might do next. Now, I was free to focus entirely on protecting myself and planning my response. The game was about to change, and Monica Langford had no idea what was coming. I woke up at 2:30 in the morning to the smell of smoke. For a moment, my sleep-fogged brain tried to make sense of it. Maybe someone was having a late barbecue or burning brush in their backyard. But as I became fully conscious, I realized the smell was too strong, too close, and growing stronger by the second. I rolled out of bed and looked out my bedroom window toward the barn. What I saw made my blood freeze. Orange flames were already climbing the wooden walls of the structure where my horses had lived for over a year. I grabbed my jeans and boots, pulling them on as I ran toward the kitchen where I kept a fire extinguisher. The small device felt pathetically inadequate as I sprinted across the yard toward the burning barn, but it was all I had. By the time I reached the structure, the flames had spread across most of the roof and were beginning to consume the hay storage area where I kept winter feed for the horses. The heat was intense, driving me back even as I tried to get close enough to use the extinguisher. I managed to spray down one section of wall, creating a temporary gap in the flames, but it was like trying to stop a flood with a coffee cup. The fire department arrived within 15 minutes, but by then the barn was fully engulfed. I stood in my yard, soot-covered and exhausted, watching 3 fire trucks pump thousands of gallons of water onto what had been my pride and joy just an hour earlier. The firefighters worked efficiently, but they were fighting to prevent the fire from spreading to nearby trees rather than trying to save the barn itself. Captain Williams, a grizzled veteran who looked like he'd seen every type of fire Texas could produce, walked over to where I was standing. "I'm sorry about your barn, son. Any idea how this might have started?" I told him I had no idea, that I'd been asleep when the smoke woke me up. Captain Williams nodded and made notes on his clipboard. "We'll have an investigator out here tomorrow to determine the cause. Could have been electrical, could have been spontaneous combustion from hay, could have been any number of things." As the firefighters continued their work, I became aware of other people gathering in the darkness. Russell Dean appeared at my side, having thrown on clothes and driven over as soon as he saw the flames. Several other neighbors had come out to watch, drawn by the sirens and the glow of the fire against the night sky. And then, to my amazement, Monica Langford arrived. She pulled up in her white BMW, climbed out wearing a silk robe and slippers, and walked over with an expression of concern that might have fooled someone who didn't know her as well as I was beginning to. "Oh no, Wade," Monica gasped, clutching her robe. "Were the horses... Oh, that's tragic. I warned you about wooden structures." Her voice carried just the right mixture of shock and sympathy, loud enough for the other neighbors to hear. "The horses are safe," I said, watching her face carefully. "I moved them to another ranch yesterday." Something shock? Disappointment? Flashed across her face, gone in a blink, replaced by an expression of relief that seemed just a little too practiced. "Thank goodness," she said. "I was so worried when I saw the flames. These old wooden structures can be so dangerous." She gestured toward the burning barn as if it were a regrettable accident waiting to happen. "Hope you had insurance." The way she said it made my skin crawl, as if she were already calculating how this disaster might benefit her long-term plans for the neighborhood. The fire was finally extinguished around 4 a.m, leaving behind a blackened skeleton of what had once been a beautiful barn. The smell of smoke and burnt wood hung heavy in the air, and steam rose from the soaked debris as the first light of dawn began to appear in the east. Captain Williams approached me with his preliminary findings. "Well, Mr. Callahan, I've got some interesting news." "Electrical? No way. The fire danced too fast, too hot. Whoever did this poured gasoline like they were baptizing the place in flame." I felt my hands clench into fists. "Are you saying this was arson?" Captain Williams nodded grimly. "That's exactly what I'm saying. Someone wanted your barn to burn down, and they made sure it would happen fast and hot." I looked around at the neighbors who were still standing in my yard, watching the firefighters pack up their equipment. Monica was talking to Mrs. Henderson from down the street, her voice full of sympathy and concern for my terrible loss. Russell caught my eye and nodded toward his house, suggesting we needed to talk privately. But before I could move, Monica approached me again. "Wade, I want you to know that despite our recent disagreements, I'm truly sorry this happened. If there's anything the HOA can do to help you rebuild." She reached out and actually touched my arm, a gesture of comfort that made my stomach turn. We're all neighbors here after all. I looked down at her hand on my arm, then directly into her eyes. "I appreciate the offer, Monica. I really do, but I think I can handle this on my own." As the fire trucks pulled away and the neighbors began to drift back to their homes, I stood alone in my yard, staring at the ruins of my barn. The structure where I'd spent countless peaceful hours caring for my horses was now nothing but charred wood and twisted metal. Everything I'd built here, the life I'd tried to create, the peace I'd thought I'd found, had literally gone up in smoke. But as I stood there in the growing daylight, breathing in the acrid smell of destruction, I realized something important. I wasn't heartbroken or defeated. I was absolutely furious. Monica Langford had just made the biggest mistake of her life. She'd escalated this conflict beyond harassment, beyond bureaucratic games, beyond anything that could be solved through normal channels. She'd committed a felony, and she thought she was going to get away with it, but she was wrong. Dead wrong. The game had changed completely, and it was time for me to change with it. I spent the next 3 days in a strange state of calm that Russell later described as the quiet before the storm. The insurance adjuster confirmed what Captain Williams had suspected. My barn had been deliberately destroyed by someone who knew how to start a fire that would burn hot and fast. The police detective assigned to the case, a tired-looking woman named Detective Santos, asked all the right questions about enemies, disputes, and recent conflicts. I told her about my ongoing issues with the HOA, but I was careful not to make direct accusations without proof. Santos nodded and took notes, but I could tell she viewed this as just another property crime in a suburban neighborhood where such things weren't supposed to happen. The breakthrough came on Thursday morning when Russell knocked on my door with information that changed everything. "I've been doing some asking around," he said, settling into my kitchen chair with the satisfied expression of a retired cop who still knew how to work an investigation. "Turns out, Monica's been planning something special for this weekend. She's throwing what she calls a victory pool party on Saturday afternoon. Sent out invitations to about 40 people, all the HOA board members, her lawyer friends, some city council members, and a bunch of other influential folks from around town." Russell pulled out a folded piece of paper. "Mrs. Patterson across the street got an invitation by mistake. Wrong address on the envelope. Monica's secretary apparently isn't too careful with the mailing list." I read the invitation, printed on expensive cardstock with elegant script. A pool party to commemorate the successful resolution of several community challenges. That's HOA speak for "I got rid of the horse guy." The party was scheduled for Saturday from 2 to 6 p.m., with pool activities, catered dining, and presentations on upcoming neighborhood enhancement projects. Russell leaned forward. "Gets better. Mrs. Patterson overheard Monica on the phone yesterday, talking about how the horse problem had been permanently resolved, and how the neighborhood could now move forward with proper development." That's when the idea hit me. an idea so perfectly appropriate that I almost laughed out loud. Monica wanted to celebrate her victory with a pool party? Fine. I'd give her a pool party she'd never forget. I spent the rest of Thursday working out the logistics. Jake Martinez was happy to help when I explained what I had in mind, and he even offered to provide transportation for thunder, storm, and lightning. Those horses deserve a chance to cool off, he said with a grin. Texas summers are brutal, and I bet Monica's got a nice big pool. Russell volunteered to handle reconnaissance, mapping out the best approach routes and timing for the operation. I've been wanting to see someone take that woman down a peg for years, he admitted. Friday was devoted to final preparations. I spent the morning at Jake's ranch, working with my horses to make sure they were comfortable with the plan. Thunder, storm, and lightning were all excellent swimmers. I'd trained them myself during our early morning sessions at a stock pond on Jake's property. They trusted me completely, and they seemed to sense that something exciting was going to happen. Thunder nuzzled my shoulder like he understood the mission. This wasn't just a prank, it was justice, and they were ready. Jake and I loaded them into his horse trailer around noon, timing our arrival in Meadowbrook Estates for maximum impact. The party would be in full swing by 2:30, with all of Monica's guests gathered around her pool area to celebrate her latest victory. As we drove back toward my neighborhood, I reflected on how perfectly this plan addressed Monica's crimes. She destroyed my property, terrorized my animals, and tried to drive me from my home using methods that went far beyond legal harassment. She'd broken the law and used her influence to escape consequences. Now she was literally celebrating her criminal behavior in front of the very people who enabled her abuse of power. I wasn't just planning to embarrass her. Not anymore. At first, all I wanted was to reclaim my peace, to make a point. But then I remembered the heat of the fire on my face, the smell of burnt wood, the quiet emptiness of my pasture. I remembered Monica's silk robe and that fake gasp, "Oh no, Wade," like she hadn't just watched it all go up in smoke. Something shifted. This wasn't just about me, it was about every neighbor she silenced, every life she sanitized for the sake of her fake paradise. She weaponized bylaws and wine nights. Now it was time to turn her rules against her. I didn't need to outshout her. I just needed to let my horses speak the language everyone understands. Chaos, spectacle, truth. And trust me, nothing exposes tyranny like a wet silk dress, a ruined pool party, and 40 witnesses with phones already recording. Jake parked his trailer at Russell's house, which provided the perfect staging area for our operation. Russell had mapped out the perfect flank. Monica's security system was designed to keep out raccoons and rebellious teenagers, not a covert equine strike team. She's got motion sensors near the house, he reported, but nothing around the pool area. Guess she figured nobody would be crazy enough to crash her party uninvited. I checked my watch. 2:15 p.m. The party had been underway for 15 minutes, which meant Monica's guests would be relaxed, drinks would be flowing, and everyone's attention would be focused on socializing rather than watching for unexpected visitors. We led thunder, storm, and lightning through the park area, approaching Monica's property from the side where the fence was lowest and the landscaping provided the most cover. The horses moved quietly, sensing that this was a special mission that required stealth and precision. As we got closer, I could hear the sounds of the party, laughter, conversation, and the kind of background music that wealthy people play when they want to seem cultured. Through the gaps in the hedge, I could see Monica's guests mingling around the massive infinity pool, holding wine glasses and plates of expensive catered food. Monica herself was holding court near the pool's edge, wearing a flowing white dress and gesturing animatedly as she spoke to a group of well-dressed listeners. The moment had arrived. I took a deep breath, checked the leads on my horses one final time, and prepared to give Monica Langford the surprise of her life. "Ready, boys?" I whispered to thunder, storm, and lightning. "Time to show these folks what a real pool party looks like." At exactly 2:30 p.m., I led thunder, storm, and lightning through the gap in Monica's hedge and into her perfectly manicured backyard. The effect was immediate and spectacular. The first person to notice us was a man in a navy blazer who had been reaching for a shrimp from the catering table. His mouth fell open, and the shrimp tumbled from his fingers onto the pristine patio. Excuse me?" he called out, loud enough to get the attention of several nearby guests. There appeared to be horses in the yard. The conversation around the pool began to falter as more people turned to stare at the unexpected arrivals. Monica was in the middle of explaining her vision for enhanced community standards to the city council members when she became aware of the growing commotion behind her. She turned around slowly, and I watched her face cycle through confusion, recognition, and finally pure horror as she realized what was happening. "What the hell are you doing?" she shrieked, her carefully modulated party voice cracking with fury. "This is private property. You're trespassing." I smiled and continued walking toward the pool with my horses, who were taking everything in stride. Thunder actually seemed to enjoy the attention, tossing his head and prancing slightly as if he were at a horse show rather than crashing a suburban pool party. "Actually, Monica, I'm still a member of this HOA," I said, loud enough for all 40 guests to hear clearly. "I pay my fees every month, which means I have every right to use the community amenities. And this pool is listed as a shared community resource in the HOA bylaws." Several guests began pulling out their phones, some to call for help, and others to record what was quickly becoming the most entertaining event in Meadowbrook Estates history. Monica's face was turning an interesting shade of purple that clashed badly with her white dress. "You cannot bring livestock into a residential pool area. This is insane. Someone call the police." But before anyone could reach for their phones, Thunder made the decision for all of us. The big gelding had been eyeing the crystal-clear water of Monica's infinity pool with obvious interest, and Texas summers are brutally hot for horses wearing thick coats. With a joyful whinny that echoed across the yard, Thunder cannonballed into the deep end like a warhorse charging a moat. Wine glasses flew, caviar floated by like battlefield debris, and someone screamed as the tsunami of chlorinated water crashed across the patio. Storm and Lightning, not to be outdone, immediately followed their leader into the refreshing water. The chaos that followed was absolute and magnificent. Women in expensive dresses stumbled backward, trying to protect their designer outfits from the cascading pool water. Men in suits cursed and grabbed for their phones, which were getting soaked despite their efforts to hold them high. The catered food table was completely drenched, turning elegant appetizers into soggy debris that floated sadly in puddles of chlorinated water. And in the middle of it all, 3 horses were having the time of their lives, splashing and swimming around Monica's pool like it was their own private water park. Monica herself had stumbled backward and fallen into a poolside chair, her white dress now clinging to her body in a way that definitely wasn't appropriate for a community leadership event. Her carefully styled hair was plastered to her head, and her makeup was running down her face in dark streams that made her look like a rejected reality show contestant. "Get them out!" she screamed at no one in particular. "Get those disgusting animals out of my pool." But her guests were too busy trying to salvage their own appearance and possessions to worry about helping with horse removal. Monica staggered across the soaked patio, trying to salvage what was left of her dignity, as Storm shook his mane and sent another wave of chlorinated justice cascading across the canapé table. One guest, a councilwoman in pearls, slipped and fell into a tray of shrimp skewers, shrieking as her glass of Merlot stained her white blouse like a crime scene photo. A man in Gucci loafers screamed something about allergies and fled toward the side gate. Meanwhile, Lightning had discovered the floating fruit display and was joyfully smashing watermelon slices with his hooves like a 4-legged Jackson Pollock. Monica's voice cracked again, desperate. Someone do something. But no one moved. Her kingdom was flooding, and her court had turned to spectators. In the background, I could hear the faint sound of someone live streaming. "Welcome to the HOA games," they whispered. "Day 1, the reaping." That's when Derek Winslow surprised everyone, including me. The normally quiet vice president of the HOA suddenly stood up from where he'd been cowering behind a potted plant and pointed directly at Monica. "You want to know what's disgusting?" he shouted, his voice carrying across the chaos. "What's disgusting is that you hired someone to burn down Wade's barn." The sudden accusation cut through the noise like a knife, and even my splashing horses seemed to quiet down to listen. "That's right," Derek continued, his face red with anger and embarrassment. "Monica Langford paid someone to commit arson because she couldn't get rid of Wade legally." His voice cracked with emotion. "She blackmailed me, said she'd ruin my son's college scholarship if I didn't vote her way." The remaining party guests fell silent, staring at Derek with the kind of fascination usually reserved for car accidents. Monica's mouth opened and closed like a fish out of water, but no sound came out. Derek was just getting started. "She threatened me too," he declared. "Said if I didn't support her harassment campaign against Wade, she'd make sure my plumbing business lost all its municipal contracts. She's been terrorizing this entire neighborhood for years, and everyone's been too scared to speak up." Several guests began nodding and murmuring agreement, and I realized that Monica's reign of terror was finally coming to an end. Monica tried to salvage the situation with denials and threats, but her credibility was shot. Here she was, soaking wet and disheveled, being accused of arson in front of 40 witnesses while 3 horses leisurely swam laps in her pool. The visual was so absurd, so perfectly symbolic of her loss of control, that even her strongest supporters began backing away. Within 20 minutes, the police arrived, not to arrest me for trespassing, but to question Monica about Derek's allegation. Detective Santos, who had been investigating my barn fire, looked around at the scene with barely concealed amusement. "Mr. Callahan," she said, "I think we need to have another conversation about your recent difficulties with the HOA." 3 hours later, Monica Langford was under arrest for conspiracy to commit arson, and I was back at my property with thunder, storm, and lightning, who were still damp but extremely satisfied with their afternoon's work. The next morning, I began construction on a new barn, larger and better than the one that had burned down, and right next to it, I installed something special. A swimming pool designed specifically for horses, complete with a wooden sign that read, "Horse Swimming Pool. HOA approved." Monica's charges would eventually lead to a conviction and 2 years in federal prison. The HOA elected new leadership, and Derek Winslow proved to be a vast improvement over his predecessor. As I sat on my porch that evening, watching my horses graze peacefully in their pasture, I reflected on the events that had brought me to this point. Sometimes justice comes through the courts, sometimes through community action, and sometimes through 3 horses who aren't afraid to make a splash when the situation calls for it. Monica Langford had tried to destroy my life because she couldn't tolerate anything that didn't fit her perfect suburban vision. But she learned an important lesson that day. Sometimes when you play with fire, you get burned. And sometimes when you think you've won the game, the other player changes the rules entirely. In the end, the best revenge isn't getting even, it's living well with good neighbors, loyal animals, and a swimming pool that's always open to horses who know how to make an entrance.
Another wild tale courtesy of QA Stories. If your jaw's on the floor, you're in the right place. Subscribe and stay shocked.